My name is Rusti Eisenberg, and I'm the co-founder of Brooklyn for Peace and professor of U.S. History and American Foreign Policy at Hofstra University. As some of you know, Brooklyn for Peace was founded in 1984 by a group of parents with children at a local nursery school. Over the years, we remained active, and then in 2001, we became a much larger group of activists and morphed into Brooklyn for Peace in response to the tragic events of 9/11 and afterwards. As some here will remember, after the attack on the World Trade Center, the mood here in Brooklyn was one of shock, grief, and amazing kindness. People were looking for ways to help one another. Within a week of 9/11, Arab American Family Support Network and a local synagogue called for a peace vigil on the Brooklyn Promenade. Brooklyn for Peace assisted with this effort, and we all thought, oh, well, maybe 100 people are going to come. Instead, the entire promenade was packed with people, quietly carrying candles and standing in solidarity with one another, Christians, Jews, Muslims, non-believers, people in between, all there. And actually, you can find a photo of that actually in the New York Times, because it was such a remarkable event and such an expression of the spirit that was really here in Brooklyn. Back then, it was theoretically possible for our government to respond to the attacks by treating them as an international crime while attempting to apprehend the perpetrator. But given the militarization of our government, many of us recognized from the outset that there was a likelihood of war. During those early weeks, we circulated a widely signed statement called Voices from Brooklyn. And so we can get to our speakers. I'm not going to read all of it, but I just want to read a few excerpts. We are united. This was back, we did this in September 2001. We are united in our sorrow and shock at the September 11th attacks upon our city. In one terrible moment of violence, we've experienced what happens when those bent on vengeance target innocent civilians. And therefore, we made several pledges, and I'll just read three. We pledge to support effective efforts under international law to identify, capture, and try the perpetrators of this horrific crime. We pledge to protect the lives of innocent civilians in all countries who must not be made the next victims of another indiscriminate assault from the sky or ground. We pledge to defend our civil liberties and safeguard the distinctive values of a free, democratic society. Inspired by the love and heroism of so many of our fellow New Yorkers, we seek to halt war and promote peace. Clearly, the Bush administration hadn't read our statement, and they chose a different path. And today, millions of people are still living with the tragic consequences of that. For our program tonight, we're very honored to have two extraordinary speakers who have in different ways been near the front line of the ill-conceived war on terror. We thought it especially important at this juncture to understand their experiences while attempting to think more clearly about useful actions for the future. Our first speaker will be Major Danny Sjursen. Grew up here as a New Yorker in Staten Island and is a graduate of West Point. A retired U.S. Army officer, he served combat duties with reconnaissance units in Iraq and Afghanistan, and later taught history.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be speaking, even if it's virtually, in Brooklyn. My mother's side of the family were what called themselves native Staten Islanders, which I always thought was fascinating given some of the history of Native American New York, and my father's side is Sunset Park and Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. So I wish we were all in person. It's always great to get home. This is an interesting topic and an interesting time. You know, the 9/11 anniversary kind of just happened. A lot of us were probably busy who were even vaguely in the activist community, anti-war community at that time. But today's important too, and I'll get to that. Whenever I hear bios of myself, it's sort of strange because I think, what would 17-year-old me think about the bio? And I think the answer is he would really like the first half. Combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, West Point, just, that's the good stuff. To 17-year-old me, when my mother signed me in, to go on technically active duty at West Point. And I think I would shake my head in dismay and misunderstanding and confusion about the second part, sort of turning against the war and speaking and writing. It was mentioned that I keep pretty busy with this stuff. I'm not sure if it's a lot of positive or helpful material that I'm putting out, but certainly I'm doing a lot. Maybe that's because on some level, at least the Nuremberg principle, I'm like a reformed war criminal. Wars of aggression, illegal wars, if there's such a thing as reform. And maybe it's that lapsed Catholic kind of background that's left in me that leads me to kind of take such a role where I can in the smallest ways to speak out against really the last 20 years of obscenity. And the truth is that there's nothing heroic about my own story or journey. The truth is I stayed in too long. I kept coming up with reasons to remain complicit. But I think that there's something deep in the American psyche, and this is an explanation rather than an excuse, that being a soldier, especially as a young male, as a young white American male, because there's that racial component in American history, for a moment there, I was sort of a real star. In certain communities, right? I was praised and patted by everyone in my life system. Back home, within the military, on paper, I looked all right for a while. But as I look back 20 years on at, say, 9/11 and the events that followed, the forever war, which is ongoing despite what happened in Afghanistan, it leads me to a lot of questions about what was it all for, what drove it, what continues to drive it, and where do we go from here? This year at the 9/11 anniversary was, obviously the 20th. I did local TV, I did articles, radio, and I don't know, I guess on a personal level, I caught myself a little frustrated in some ways, a little more melancholy maybe even than some years. But at the same time, hopeful by groups like this, and what I think are the rumblings of a real wave outside of the establishment, outside of Washington. I was in Washington for 9/9 and 9/10 just a few days ago. It's an echo chamber there, and the militarists largely remain in charge, but there are rumblings of real change. And I think budding alliances between sort of the libertarian right, which isn't really my world, but aligned in some ways on foreign policy, and then of course a growing progressive left. So there's that hope side. When we look about where do we go from here, it raises the question of lessons learned. Now, for any historians in the group, and I know we have some, lessons and history, that's no good, right? Anyone who's been to grad school is like, no, let's not talk about lessons learned. But seriously, at the same time, I think that there are elements that we need to reflect on from the last 20 years. And 9/11 is obvious, right, to talk about that. But today's 9/14. And of course, the House vote for the authorization for the use of military force, the first of two that are both still on the books, that put in force really the legal apparatus for forever wars. I've called it the day that America became Israel. I've been attacked for that. The day that we became a militarized state, or maybe we always had been, but it really put in place almost in a de jure rather than de facto way that the United States is now in fact a permanent war state. Now that may not be how people saw it exactly back then within the citizenry, but it is certainly the way a lot of important and powerful people within the Bush administration were already talking. Frankly, they were talking that way before 9/11, some of them. And I think that that's important. But what followed from that authorization for the use of military force was this apparatus, this mechanism, both politically and I would argue socially and culturally, for an endless cycle of war that doesn't particularly affect the citizenry, at least in direct ways, but does have enormous effects on the world and on a small percentage of Americans who are complicit and serve. Who knew that on 9/14, while the World Trade Center was, of course, still smoldering and my uncles were still digging for their friends, I come from a firefighter family, who knew that the real hero that day would be the lone dissenting vote among 500 plus congressmen and senators That, of course, being Representative Barbara Lee, who received death threats, was lampooned and attacked, and just the pejoratives were thrown everywhere. But that lone dissenting voice looks pretty prescient in just about everything she said in that very short speech, but powerful one that really has to go down in history among the great American sort of dissents on the Congress floor. But it wasn't me. I didn't think so. So as we think about how we got here and where we go from here, I thought that I might just dare to sort of trace my own story, or more importantly, my response to the larger story over the last 20 years since that day. I was a believer, I guess, to the extent that I understood how the system worked. I was 17 when I went to West Point on July 2nd of 2001. This was before 9/11, and the understanding is that, you know, joining the military, even going to the academy in July of 01, you might expect a tour in Kosovo or Macedonia. If things got real bad, there might be a disaster in Somalia like there was in 93, or maybe 100-hour ground war in the Persian Gulf. But truthfully, as much as the heroics and the bands and the flags and the chest thumping that as a 17-year-old I just absolutely loved at the time, I had no real expectation that I would go to war. Not a real war, and certainly no expectation that I would spend, you know, the rest of my adult life really after that training, preparing, and then going to these wars, let alone turning against them. When 9/11 happened that morning, I was in boxing class and someone ran in and yelled something vaguely about the towers going down. We ran in from our mandatory pugilism class. It's a rare thing in the university world, I would say. And we watched, and I saw the second, you know, plane hit and the whole thing. And the truth is that morning, and then for the next 4 years, really, until I graduated in May of 2005, I think my biggest fear, and I hate saying it in a way, but I feel like I have to, is that I'd miss it, that the wars would end and that I wouldn't get to go. And how shameful it would be to not wear a combat patch on the right shoulder of my uniform and explain to people that these wars went on and I missed them. But that was a real fear. It's absurd when I look back for two reasons. Number one, the raw just chauvinism and toxic masculinity involved in that is staggering, but it was common in my community, that being the, you know, young officers military community. And then also, of course, I had nothing to worry about. The wars would continue. While I was at West Point from 2001, you know, from September of 01 until May of 05, you know, a lot of things happened, of course. There was Guantanamo, there was the trumped up false pretenses, illegal and immoral invasion of Iraq. Casualties started going through the roof on the American side. Of course, they were exponentially higher among locals, including civilians. It became quite common for the loudspeaker at breakfast to call for a moment of silence for graduates who were being killed, mostly in Iraq. Afghanistan invasion had already happened, but that was sort of, had seemed to have gone well. Well, I finally make it to Iraq and I get my wish and I get to go to war in November of 2006. I will admit, I'd always been a bit of a reader, a slightly more cerebral bear than the average among the cadets at West Point, who were smart but often weren't really reading anything critical of the American foreign policy or the warfare state. But I did start to have doubts. I had read a few books that gave me some doubts about this Iraq war, but overall, my feeling was there's a war, I want to be part of it. And I get to Baghdad in October of 06, kind of at the height of the sectarian violence, you know, 3,000, 3,500-ish Iraqi civilians being, you know, executed in the streets. In this sectarian civil war, that it was clear to me, although I didn't do much about it, it was clear to me that we had started this through our ill-advised invasion, that we were stuck in the middle of it now that we had gone on and kind of destroyed this country, and that both sides were attacking us. And the interesting thing is that by November of 06, you know, I was against that war, wildly and totally in private and among my closest friends, not so much publicly. I didn't take any courageous action. I should have resigned. But the reality was I was part of the problem. And I watched, it really was sort of a turning point in my life, which is almost grotesque to say when you think about the amount of people for whom it was a real turning point, that being the Iraqi people, but it was. 15 months there, got extended for the surge. Watching what happens when the United States destroys a society, watching the maelstrom, the madness, the futility, and the hopelessness of the whole thing, it was like peering into hell. But the truth is, and I think this was true for many Americans on the more establishment left, I suppose, or the Democratic Party, by that point, I decided I was a liberal, which was a courageous act among young officers in the Army at the time. I mean, I thought I was courageous. I grew my hair a little longer, you know. I would talk smack a little bit on the side, and I was ready to vote for a Democrat. And I thought Barack Obama should be the answer because he was going to get us out of Iraq. He was sort of the hope, right? And it wasn't just a campaign slogan. He was like the last hope to make sure that I didn't have to go back to Iraq and then we didn't have to do another thing like this. I would even take off my uniform and, you know, put on like a hoodie and go into southern Indiana across the river, Fort Knox, where I was stationed during the campaign, or the tail end of that presidential campaign in 08. And I would like canvass for Obama in southern Indiana. It was got a lot of dirty looks there, but he did win that state and the election. And I was kind of on that train. I was on the hope and, you know, change train. After that, I get sent to Fort Riley, Kansas, and things aren't changing. Not really anyway, because what Barack Obama said is that the good war was in Afghanistan. You know, and people forgot that in his speech against the Iraq war, when he was just a state senator, he's very careful to say he's against dumb wars. So Afghanistan was supposedly a good war, and what did we get from that? But another surge, my second. This was a real war in southern Afghanistan, you know, on the Taliban's home turf. It became incredibly obvious to me that we weren't winning, that I was being fought to a standstill by my mirror, whoever, like I was a captain in charge of about 100 soldiers, whoever the Taliban captain is, was fighting me to a standstill. The Taliban was somewhat popular down there, or at least had control of society, or a bit of both. It was clear to me that this was nothing to do with human rights, nothing to do with counterinsurgency, protect the population, population-centric counterinsurgency. It was all BS. We were fighting for our lives, and we only controlled the ground we stood on. It was like Vietnam all over again. And I was dropping a lot of bombs. I mean, that's what I was. I was a professional airstrike caller. You know, we'd get ambushed, and I'd call airstrikes and try to get my guys out of there. And sometimes we killed the people we meant to, and sometimes we did not. And I mean, I was bombs away, Dan. You know, that was a joke. And I didn't believe in that war. The truth is, I was a mercenary. Didn't believe in the war any longer. Didn't believe in any of them at this point. And I was there in the 10th anniversary. That was 10 years ago. They sent a Reuters reporter down to my base because they were looking for a New Yorker. And they're like, well, we'll take Staten Island, close enough. And so they sent a reporter down to ask me what I thought about it. And I said, this has nothing to do with 9/11. I'm fighting farm boys with guns. You know, basically we shouldn't be here. And I definitely upset my colonels. Anyway, to kind of wrap it up, and so we have time for questions, after Afghanistan, after fighting as essentially a mercenary for pay and to protect my guys, I thought, you know, to try to like be a decent officer. I thought I was decent to the Afghan people as I was dropping bombs on them. I mean, that was the kind of dissonance that was existing. I started to ask myself the question from that movie American History X that the, you know, sort of teacher asked the, you know, reforming neo-Nazi when he's in prison. He says, has anything you've done made your life or essentially the world any better? And I could no longer answer that in the affirmative after 10 years in. So after that, when I got accepted to go back and teach history at West Point, I started looking deep. And my critique got more systemic despite being in uniform. And I was teaching a lot of sort of what is obvious history in civilian universities, but was rarely taught at West Point, really looking at the racial and the genocide background in the United States and the militarism and imperialism that's been long going on. And during that time, and we're going to hear some more about this with our following speaker, you know, things were going on like Obama is in charge, but we have escalated drone war, the surge in Afghanistan, assassinations of even American citizens with no due process. Gitmo's still open, right? Gitmo stays open for a lot of reasons, and there's no accountability for the crimes during the Bush or the Obama years, and the CIA basically tries to bury the torture report. And the whole thing, it became clear, was really going to go on forever. And it sort of broke me. And the war is still going on. And that's what I fear, is that Afghanistan, okay, our uniformed troops left. Some people are saying that that was a big mistake because look what a mess it was. And it was a mess, of course. But I think Fareed Zakaria, of all people, said that there's no graceful way to end a war or lose a war. But we're still fighting in 25 to 30 places on some level. And what's become clear is that war will become, or has already become, an abstraction, almost invisible, waged at low intensity for Americans, but high intensity if you're under the bombs, where it sure feels like a real war. And that this will be done in such a way to stifle dissent. And that may become the new American way of war, just like the old Russell Weigley book. After it all, I was reminded of basically two works of fiction or veteran historic fiction. Tim O'Brien, the Vietnam vet, who wrote in The Things They Carried, one of the short stories, How to Tell a True War Story was the title, that even though war was terrible, it made him want to be a better man, and that it, made him like look at the world a different way, and that he wanted decency and peace and things he didn't know before he was there. And I had started to feel that way during my deployments. And then I thought about Oliver Stone, the movie Platoon, the character based on him, Chris Taylor, when he's leaving the war in the helicopter, and he says that those of us who did make it have an obligation to teach to others what we know and to try with what's left of our lives to find a goodness and a meaning in this life. I don't know that I can do that, certainly not alone, but I try. And I think on my soldiers, the lives and the limbs that dozens of them lost for $30,000 to $40,000 a year versus the war industry executives who have been raking in billions, who got rich on the blood of mostly poor Americans and then exponentially more blood of others. And I worry about a kid being born after 9/11 being killed in one of these wars. People who were born just months before 9/11 were killed in the Kabul bombing, Marines. 3 or 4 of them were born in the year 2000 or early 2001. But I wonder, finally, if we as Americans, if the broader public is ready or big enough to recognize the real victims, 330 at a bare minimum estimate, up to 1 million or more civilians overseas killed as a result of American warfare since 9/11. The largest refugee wave since World War II, the reputation of America, what's left of it, tarnished perhaps for generations, and the world certainly a worse place, and my own complicity in that. Well, I hope we are big enough to recognize that, and I think the answer on where we go from here is that overseas, America's presence needs a lot less of me. A lot less of who I was, a lot less machine guns, a lot less people kitted up in body armor with cool $150 glasses, and more diplomats, human rights workers, activists. And, now, if ever, over the last 20 years, it was necessary the whole time, but if not now, I don't know when. This is a time, I think, not for pageantry patriotism, but for patriotic dissent.
Watching today, I don't know if anybody saw this today, but as some Democrats and Republicans are lambasting the administration for withdrawing from Afghanistan. I think I saw Menendez, he's in a rage. But you expect Republicans to do it, but the Democrats are really making a huge fuss about leaving Afghanistan. Many of them are. And it's really a reminder of how important it is for us to build the peace movement. And to create momentum for more diplomacy instead of war. Because the reality is that this withdrawal, sadly enough, has actually emboldened the hawks in both political parties. So the importance of our work, I think, is, if anything, through these last weeks really underscored. Now, in the chat, you'll find a flyer that we've produced about Afghanistan, and I hope you'll download it and share it widely. It's also important to call your member of Congress and senators, asking them to cut the military budget, to participate in international efforts to provide the Afghan people with food, healthcare, and jobs, and to maximize the admission of Afghan refugees who are seeking asylum here in the United States.